So, in the spirit of complicating Jewish ethnicities, I, a Jew from Poland, am going to pretend that I'm actually a German Jew, and we're going to start on time. This is what Laura Limonic's book is going to do to you. I'm telling you, everything is complicated. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Małgorzata Bakalaś-Diverge, and I don't expect you to be able to memorize it. It's okay. And I'm a director of academic programs here, and on behalf of the center, I am thrilled to introduce our conversation tonight, which is going to be built on and inspired by the book Kugel and Frijoles by Laura Limonic, standing here, and soon sitting here, hopefully. This is also a book you will be able to buy, and Laura generously agreed to sign it for you. So please keep that in mind. Laura is an assistant professor of sociology at the College of Old Westbury of the State University of New York. Her research is in the area of contemporary immigration in the United States and the integration trajectories of ethnic and ethno-religious groups. Her work has been supported by the Berman Foundation, the Association of Jewish Studies, and the Templeton Trust. Together with us tonight is also Eric Lach, who is going to have a conversation with Laura and make it even more interactive and hopefully complicated. Complicated is the word of this week here, so we like to say it a lot. Eric writes for The New Yorker, where he covers politics. He previously served there as a deputy news editor. So we are very happy to have him here. It makes me very uncomfortable that you guys are standing. So please have a seat. This is also a way for us to recognize you. Tonight is going to be a special night, but it will also be a night as usual here at the center, because this is what we do best here. We discuss, share stories, remember, laugh, and complicate and hopefully open up new conversations. The Center for Jewish History being home to the extraordinary archival collections of our 5 partner organizations: American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, the Ivo Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum. And we all collaborate to preserve history, nourish scholarship, facilitate conversations. We strive to constantly move between the academically rigorous and the publicly friendly, helping raise questions that help make sense of the world we live in, and create a safe, open, historically informed space to address these questions together. It is what lets us strive to move beyond numerous borders and numerous accents. That's why you have to suffer my Polish accent. And look for spaces of experiment, uncomfortable questions, and intellectual restlessness. That too is brought to you thanks to the archives that we happen to be a home of. So this night is going to be very special, but it will also be hopefully a night as usual. And I also hope that you're going to become regulars here at the center to hear more complicated conversations and bring more nuance to our understanding of the world we live in. Please join us for the marvelous conversation and also for a small reception afterwards. Kugel and Frijoles calls for some kind of munching one way or another. So please join us for the reception and also for the book signing afterwards. Laura, Eric, the stage is yours.
Okay. So I thought I'd just start off and give hopefully brief 5 to 8 minutes of a little bit of why I wrote the book and just lightly touch on some of the things that I wanted to highlight, and then Eric and I will continue the conversation. But first of all, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Margot. Thank you all for being here. It's very special to be here, so thank you. And when Margot asked me to say a few words about why, about the book, she said, well, why don't you start off about why you wrote the book? And I thought, God, there's so many reasons. But mostly it has been my own personal experience, which is sometimes a lot of where our sort of questions arise from. So I'm an immigrant from Argentina. I'm Jewish, hence the Jewish, Argentine, Latina theme. And we immigrated in 1980. I was 7 years old, and we came sort of at I would say, the kind of the end of the military dictatorship. We came because my dad wanted to leave, and he got a fellowship to study, to do a master's in Jewish studies at Brandeis. But we didn't know any English, not one word. So they took a course. They learned 3 phrases. Hello, my name is, I don't understand, and what a pity, which I realized later really means what a pity. Not very useful in Waltham, Massachusetts. But my dad, he wasn't nervous. He wasn't nervous because while he didn't speak English, he spoke Hebrew. And he thought that would be enough to cushion the language blow. It wasn't. It was not, because unlike in Argentina, where learning and speaking Hebrew was akin to being a good Zionist and therefore a good Jew, this was not the case for American Jews. So he didn't speak Hebrew. He learned English by looking up each word in the dictionary. This was way before computers. And then he learned along the way how to be an American Jew. So he always tells the story of not only did he not speak English, but he didn't really know the Jewish customs of the day. He had his first internship at the JCC in Marblehead. And on the first day he went, and his first meeting he went, and everybody brought a brown bag lunch. You did not do this in Argentina. There was no brown bag lunches. So he was mortified. He comes home and he says to my mother, you have to pack me a lunch, which is, 1980, our gender division of labor sort of went that way back then. But so she packs him a lunch, she packs him a sandwich, a soda, and a fruit. He gets to the next meeting, the next Friday, and he has his lunch, he opens it up, and the woman next to him comments on his trait faux pas and says, is that a ham and cheese sandwich? To which my dad said, oh, no, it's turkey and cheese. And he never brought ham again. So these are funny anecdotes, but I tell them because it's they really symbolize the norms, the behaviors, the actions, the language, the ways of being that construct culture. And culture is at the heart of Jewish identity, particularly for people for whom religion is not at the heart of their Jewish identity. And culture is built within national boundaries. So the Jewish culture of an Argentine Jew or a Mexican Jew or a Venezuelan Jew looks very different from the culture of an American Jew. Of course, there are many commonalities. There are many religious commonalities, but the ways of being are very different. So what happens when Argentine Jews or Mexican Jews or Chilean Jews come here? They find that, well, they're Jewish, but they don't really fit in. They sort of straddle 2 worlds. So I set out in this book to really understand, well, what are the constraints in being Jewish and being Latino? How do you become a Latino Jew? How do you construct a new identity? What parts of your identity do you take with you? And how do you reconstruct an idea of Jewishness that is maybe different from what your idea of Jewishness was in your home country? So these are the sorts of themes that I explore in the book, along with how race plays a big part in how folks are able to integrate, how religion, even religious rights, change from country to country, and how community and identity are therefore constructed. And before I start, this already came up, so I just want to define a few things for you. Latino Jew. So it's complicated, as Margot says, but in essence, I'm thinking about Latino Jew as as how we define Latinos in the United States. Latino and Hispanic in the United States is a definition, a classification by this Office of Management and Budget in the census, which means that if you are from Latin America, from Mexico, you're from a Spanish-speaking country, you are in essence Latino. That doesn't mean that all folks identify as Latino. It also doesn't mean that if you're Latino, you're not white, or you're not black, or you're not other. Because Latino is an ethnic classification, it's not a racial classification in the census. That's how I'm using the term. My research is also on first-generation immigrants who have come to the United States. So I interviewed 85 people from Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, Puerto Rico, I think that's it. All first generation who had lived in Latin America and had come to the United States for various reasons and for different span of times.
Yeah. Okay, so before we start our conversation, let me be a mama of the house. And first of all, apologize for the noise, but it is essentially your fault because we unexpectedly have more people than we expected, which is a good problem to have. However, we had to make sure to accommodate you all, so I'm sorry for that. And I also think that I am just going to Eddie, can we relieve our panelists from this presentation so that they don't have to be with their yes, that's what I'm trying to say. It's complicated. What can I say? It's complicated. So I think it will be just easier and more comfortable for you that way. And yes, and then we will be able to enjoy it.
Okay. Is this working? Yes?
Yes.
You guys look good. Okay, well, also, I just want to say thank you for having me here, and to Margo for setting this up. And yeah, and just by way of introduction, I mean, I'm a journalist, but I'm also an old friend of Laura and her family. I'm a second-generation Latino Jew. My parents immigrated from Argentina in the early 80s, and now I live here. So I guess, Laura, thanks for writing this fascinating book. And I thought maybe a place that we could start is, for those of us who haven't read it yet or had a chance to read it yet, is just kind of just sketching out the geography that the book encompasses. Sort of, there's two kind of sets of geography, sort of pre-migration and then post-migration. So pre-migration, you're looking at primarily Argentina, Mexico, and Venezuela, and then sort of post-migration, the Northeast, Miami, Florida, and then sort of Southern California, San Diego area. And I'm wondering if we, starting with pre-migration, just kind of both, why you picked these places, and then if you could sketch a little bit about each of these places and how, before we get to the U.S., how Jews ended up in each of these countries.
Okay. I chose these particular countries because they have not only Argentina has the largest Jewish community in Latin America, and Brazil would complicate things, so I didn't want to include Brazil, but also because they also have very large migration streams. Migration streams to the United States. So it was important for me to have, for a decent sociological study to have, sort of a good number of people. And the interesting thing about, I always tell the story that people would look at me and they go, oh, well, there are Jews in Argentina? Or one of my folks that I interviewed said to me that he was at a synagogue and he said to them, oh, I'm from Venezuela, and they said, oh, that's so nice, are you converting? So there's this idea that, well, how could there be Jews in Latin America? And I thought, well, how could there not be? And they came, and I had a very nice discussion with your uncle, actually, about this.
On my mom's side or my dad's side?
On your dad's side. Jews, we tend to sort of mythologize that Jews leave because of the pogroms. Jews really leave for the most part, folks leave for economic reasons. Most migrants leave for economic reasons. And the same reasons that push people out of Europe, out of the countries of the Ottoman Empire, push people to the United States and to Latin America. They came at different times, and so I think the book lays out sort of a little bit of the differences of when the larger migration streams happened. But in Argentina, folks came during the late 1800s because there was a very wealthy man who bought land there, and you know more about this, I think.
This is Baron Hirsch.
Baron Hirsch,
Yeah.
yes.
Seeing some nods in the audience.
And then that migration sort of stopped, and folks oftentimes really preferred to come to the U.S. And after 1924, the doors were essentially closed, right? In 1924, in the United States passes a very important immigration act that essentially closes the door to new immigrants, or new immigrants that are not of preferred backgrounds. So they didn't want any more Jews. They didn't want any more Italians. They didn't want any more Polish. So they went to Latin America. But Argentina was a great place to go back then. Now, you know.
Because why? But why was Argentina? I mean, you know, there's something sort of. There's something to me that's sort of interesting in the story. And I know a little bit more about the Argentine story than the Mexican and Venezuelan story. But the idea that in part Argentina had, you know, like the U.S. had killed off the indigenous population.
Yes.
And had this vast area of land that they were trying to settle.
Absolutely.
And they wanted white people to come
Yes.
and sort of fill it up. And they were in such need that they counted Jews as
That's
white
exactly it. That's exactly it. They wanted to whiten the population, absolutely. And they didn't really expect the Jews to come. The Jews weren't really that white, but they were white enough, you know. And the Jews did something very interesting. Also, they became, in many ways, part of the Argentine gaucho, right? The cowboy, the landscape. They often talked about their Ladino background as true Spaniards. So they did a lot of, they worked very hard to be seen as Argentine.
Yeah.
I would say it didn't necessarily, you know, I don't think they were very successful in some ways. Mexicans, Venezuelans have a much larger stream of immigrants from the North African countries, from countries from the Ottoman Empire that came a little bit later. And again, because it wasn't really until 1965 that folks were able to come into the United States again.
Yeah.
So you have a long period of time where after the Depression, you don't really want to come here, right, during the Depression. The folks that were coming over after the war were war refugees. So the folks that were really, it was hard to get in here.
Yeah.
So they went
Well,
to
what's interesting to me, and you sketch this out in the book, is the way that particularly in Mexico, Venezuela, Mexico maybe most of all, there's a kind of back end limit where the Mexican government and the Catholic Church are so closely, you know, intertwined that Mexico is not seen as a place that Jews
Absolutely.
should go until, or you know, wanted to go, or until, well, into the, I guess, late 19th century, early 20th century.
Sure, absolutely.
And so how do those Jews, was it good for the Jews to go to these countries?
So how do they do?
How do they do?
I mean, the Jews did pretty well, for the most part. You know, Argentina is the society that in many ways, most looks like ours, where Jews really straddle sort of all of the socioeconomic rungs. In Mexico and in Venezuela, Jews tend to be better off for a number of reasons. In part, it has to do with where they were able to insert themselves in the economy, and then how that they did as a result. What happened in Mexico, for example, was that they weren't allowed to be part of unions, for example. example. They weren't allowed to own certain things until they were, and then that sort of took off. And there were smaller communities, which is also something that I touch on a lot in the book, is that the fact that there's smaller communities creates a kind of ethnic capital, where folks in Mexico or in Venezuela do a lot of work within the communities. That's not so much the case in Argentina anymore.
Yeah, and I want to start moving us towards the U.S., but before we sort of depart, I thought another thing that's interesting in the book is you start talking about the reasons that these Latin American Jews start migrating towards the U.S. A lot of it has to do with the politics of the countries in which they're living, the economic situation in which they're living. But before that happens, a lot of the opportunity for these communities also comes out of the politics of these countries, where you talk about the kind of protectionist economies of these countries and the way they were trying to set up kind of their own, car industry or washing machine industry or whatever, in the way that created economic opportunities that before Latin American Jews come to the U.S., there's a kind of tell me if this is wrong, or a kind of parallel trajectory of a kind of typical Jewish American story, which is that the sort of first generation lands and sort of works in kind of peddlers or tailors or stuff like that, and then sort of textiles and manufacturing and things. It's sort of a kind of rise in socioeconomic status comes along with the kind of economic development of a country.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if we can tell a story towards sort of getting us to why Jews in Latin America start coming in some significant numbers to the U.S.
I think one of the things to think about is that
Do you want to get that?
I don't know, is that me? That's not me. Is that Jews are sort of Jews in Latin America are sort of one generation behind the Jews in the United States in many ways. But the grandchildren of immigrants go on to become professionals. What happens though is that these are not always the safest or the best remunerated jobs. So that's number one, but they become more prestigious. So folks don't necessarily want to run their father's wholesale business selling schmatas,
Right.
They want to make a good living as a doctor or as a lawyer, and those things are simply not always possible in Latin America. And we see that the trend in Jewish migration to to the United States mirrors the economic and political crises are sort of in tandem with the political and economic crises. So you have a big surge of Mexican migrants during the tequila crisis. You have a big surge of Argentine migrants during the hyperinflation crisis. In 2001, a lot of Argentine migrants come.
Yep.
Venezuela has had a big surge. The crisis in Venezuela has been ongoing, and there's very few folks left there. So while some folks continue to do well in Venezuela, it's, I think it's really the economic crisis, because the folks that do very well are still there.
Yeah, and let's talk, and just before we get to the U.S., let's talk about where now, sort of, in the recent past, present day, the Jewish communities in these countries kind of fit within the countries that they're in. Sort of what kind of status, what
Sure.
kind of what kind of opportunities, and how what's the popular perception of these communities.
Sure. I think that it's a difficult question to answer in many ways, because many people will give you different answers. Sure, we're part of the mainstream, but we're not, right? I think unlike the United States, what you hear a lot of in Latin America is, oh, well, we're accepted, but there are a lot of anti-Semitic jokes that I have to put up with, and that needs to be okay, because that's just kind of the deal, and I don't take it seriously. That was a refrain I heard a lot. We've seen big anti-Semitic acts in Argentina, for example, where that haven't been resolved. When I wrote the book, and the research started about 10 years ago, things have changed a lot in the United States. So whereas it was a very clear comparison for me to make, saying, well, in Latin America, the anti-Semitic acts and the microaggressions happen much more often than they do in the United States. It's hard to say that now. At the same time, there's an interesting study that shows the contact that non-Jews have with Jews. And what you tend to find is that in countries where at least the participants that I spoke with talk about how their communities are quite closed off, folks, the non-Jewish people in those countries report having less daily contact with Jews. So really, they're just not a part of their lives. I don't know if that.
Yeah, and so where do they end? So you know, we've talked about where they're coming from, but where do they end up?
Sure.
Latin Jews, you know, they're making choices about leaving home, and they're looking at the United States as a place because, like your father kind of thinking about, I'd rather sort of try things there. But how, you know, where are they going and why?
So there's a lot of not only reasons why people migrate, but really reasons why people choose to settle where they do. And oftentimes it's opportunities. We ended up in Boston because my dad got this fellowship to study, and there he was. Your parents came to New York first, I think.
For graduate
yes,
school.
for graduate school. And then they ended up in Boston for work. What I found was, what I thought was very interesting, what I found was that where you ended up, or where you first migrated, had a lot to do with not only why you came, but oftentimes your, what we call, your social capital, and really your human capital, what you bring with you, right? Your socioeconomic status. Folks that came to study, they came to study usually to very good universities. You're not going to leave Argentina to not attend a great university for the most part. Came to New York, they came to Boston, they came to areas where the academics are highly renowned.
Yeah.
You also have a lot of folks, professional folks that came for professional opportunities. Miami gets a completely different kind of immigrant, and that was very interesting.
Yeah.
So in Miami, you don't need to speak English. I don't know how you've been to Miami.
Yes.
In fact, if you don't speak Spanish, you're at a disadvantage.
It's a little weird.
Right? You go into the store, and there's very little English spoken. So there's already that. Miami operates much more like Latin America. We see the same kind of social hierarchies that exist in Latin America. Folks are much more likely to be micro-entrepreneurs in Miami than they are in New York and in Boston. Also, the cost of entry is much lower in Miami. It's cheaper. It's cheaper to get there. It's cheaper to go home. It's cheaper to live there. And many people come with an apartment already there. That doesn't mean they're super wealthy. It just means that their parents at some point, or them, or their grandparents, had bought an apartment in Miami for investment purposes, and when they needed to leave, they have it there. So the cost of entry is much lower. That means that you can come with less of a cushion. You might not have a degree. You might not necessarily have a job. And that creates a completely different migration stream, and also a different community.
Yeah. And San Diego, just
Sure.
Southern California.
Southern California is very interesting because what happens in Southern California is that it's the majority are Mexican Jews. And because there's always been a lot of cross-border activity.
Right.
The cross-border activity has been primarily business ventures, and as Mexico started to get more dangerous, or there were more opportunities, financial opportunities, folks decided to settle on the other side. But you have folks that live, Mexican Jews that live in Miami and cross the border, go back and forth all the time.
Yeah. And so how many people are we talking about here? Like what's the size of this population?
Sure, it's hard to really pinpoint, but we would say between 160 and 180,000. Just small.
Yeah.
But there are just not that many Jews in the world, We're kind of small numbers.
So
and that's first generation.
So you're you write in the book, central question is whether these Latin American immigrants are classified primarily as Jewish and therefore white, or whether and in what situations their national identity as Argentine or Mexican or Venezuelan trump their Jewish ethnic identity. And so this question of identity and choice in the context of immigration is sort of like one of the key sort of drivers of what you're working on. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us what we can say towards an answer to that central question.
So I approach the book really from not only from a immigration lens, but really a racial lens, and how immigrants that are phenotypically more like the white mainstream have more choice. And that's what happens with Latino Jews. So one of the things that I try to do in this book is to really widen our concept of what does it mean to be Latino, and who can privilege from being how can you privilege from being a white Latino? There's a lot of literature about how Jews became white and are Jews really white, but I'm firmly on the side that Jews are white.
Yeah.
Why? Well, Jews were given the right to citizenship very early on because they were seen as white, unlike other immigrants that were not. I think that's sort of the oftentimes we think about how the legal institutions really reflect the social currents. And I think it wasn't always the case, but now it's very unlikely that you are discriminated against, or you won't get into school, or you can't get a job, or someone's not going to let you eat at their establishment because you're Jewish. That doesn't mean that anti-Semitism doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But what happened in the United States is that because the United States, the pluralism, religious pluralism is enshrined in the Constitution, we're actually, we honor religion in the United States. And we honor Jewish religion. And as Jews became less ethnic, and they lost their Yiddish, and as bagels became New York food, and Seinfeld is a funny comedy that's Jewish, but not really.
Yeah.
We all kind of know he's Jewish, but that's not part of the show. It's part of the mainstream, right? It's part of New York humor. It's part of, as these things become part of the American folklore, they lose their ethnic edge. And the way that Jews are Jews now is really through, for the most part, nostalgia and religion.
And this is probably we can unpack this a little later in the context of Latin immigration in general, but this is a question, maybe too big a question to answer, but it's something that I thought a lot about when I was reading the book, setting aside the way that the white majority in the U.S. treated African Americans was sort of a different, that many groups, Irish, Italians, have been allowed to become white, essentially sort of invited into a kind of white majority, like, and do you see Jews fitting into that same pattern, or their own kind of, is it different? You know, is it different for each group, or is it a kind of overarching sort of way that immigrant groups have been allowed to sort of come in essentially to the majority?
I see it very similar to the trajectories of the Italians, the Poles, and the Irish. And I think the fact that you brought up the contrast with African Americans is very important, because essentially Jews and Italians and Irish and Poles are white because they're not black, which is how I see it. And that's very simplistic, but actually it comes from the structural racism and the institutional racism that left blacks out of the suburbs. It left blacks out of certain jobs. It didn't allow, wealth doesn't get passed down. So as these children and grandchildren of immigrants were able to rise up, blacks weren't they didn't have the same opportunities. They weren't afforded the same opportunities. So while the suburbs was this big it was kind of a big whitening push for some. It was very much so because blacks were not allowed to buy in the areas where the whites were. So right there you have a big racial division, which you continue to have in Long Island, which is interesting. And what happens and what happens in the suburbs is that as Jews left the ghetto, as Little Italy, the Lower East Side, these sorts of places where people that came back for nostalgic reasons, or they came back on a Sunday, they came back to stroll, they came back to buy some food. But their life was in the suburbs. And in the suburbs, you go to the suburban school. You you go to the town pool.
Yeah.
I remember you had a very nice town pool.
Yeah. Lexington, Massachusetts.
Yes. I think Lexington is actually a perfect example of this sort of what happened with the suburbanization of America,
Yeah.
where everybody intermingles. You don't need an ethnic institution
Yeah.
to play, to convert, to connect. You have that there. Your taxes go there, and the people that you're surrounded with are other children and grandchildren of European immigrants.
Yeah, and so this brings me to sort of one of the interesting kind of weirdnesses of the Latino Jewish sort of experiences, which is that while in past waves, unlike in past waves, Irish Poles, even the early waves of Jewish immigrants, or in modern day, the other immigrants from Latin American countries that leave a country where they have majority status and come to this country and suddenly are in a minority status situation. Latin American Jews are in this weird situation where they leave a country where they're in minority status and are at least offered the opportunity to join this sort of majority bloc because of their
Yes.
Jewishness. But so explain that, because it's a really fascinating part of your book.
And I think I do want to point out that where Latin Jews, and at least where my research took place, are places where Jews are really part of the larger mainstream, right? There's these sort of northeast and southern and San Diego where Jews are accepted. I don't know if this would be the same in, say, Kansas. It probably wouldn't, right? But so I think what happens is that oh gosh, no, I think I kind of forgot the question. Oh, the majority. So what happens, and a lot of the folks that I spoke with were this was one person said to me, I came to New York and it was like a homecoming. I don't even have to be a Jew here because I kind of just am a Jew by living here, It was this sort of like, I can tell everyone I'm Jewish and no one's gonna blink. Somebody said, Starbucks has a menorah. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You can wear a kippah and it doesn't matter. That's not the case in Latin America. While it has become more accepted, and I don't want to say that Jews are the pariah and nobody's, that's not the case.
Right.
But there's this idea that, when I had my bat mitzvah also in Massachusetts, in Newton, Massachusetts, you had the Jews, you had your Catholic friends, you had a bunch of friends, and they did their bat mitzvah the same, they came, they participated, they might have said the prayers, because that's kind of what you did, right?
Yeah.
It's much more accepted to be a Jew here in many ways, and it's also an entryway into American society, and that's one of the things that it's one of the points that I make in the book, right? It's one of people come as immigrants to an already very established community, and in such a way are sort of able to access this Jewish ethnic capital, and this might help them with getting a better job, or it might help them with knowing where to send their kids to school, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the problems that often immigrants face is that they don't have the network. They don't know what a good school is. They don't know, how college works here, those sorts of things. But those are things that you access within a community.
And then so what happens to the Latin side of this?
Sure.
religion, Laura writes in the book, is sort of a pathway into sort of becoming American, these kind of social capital sort of networks. But then, you know, you have accents, you have Latin names, you have sort of cultural practices. What happens to those things when Latin American Jews come here?
Sure. So I think the accent is a big one, and I think the accent is the way that these folks are othered. I had one woman said to me, you know, she said, you know, people know I'm Mexican because I open my mouth, and I'm Mexican. I don't have a big, you know, Jewish star on my forehead. So she said, and that's not seen as such a great thing.
Yeah.
So in business, you know, she was she had an MBA, she'd started her own business, and she said, I need a partner that speaks English, like really good English, not Mexican English, because people don't take me as seriously. So there's sort of that. And
when you're conducting these interviews, you're doing them in English or Spanish? Spanish.
You know, I always give people the option, and I would say, I think 2 people did them in English, which is interesting. So they were all in Spanish, and what happens in Spanish is that people say things because they've established. That interesting thing about language is that it establishes a comfort level, right? And this idea of a shared history that often doesn't happen in a non-native tongue. It's a language that you speak and perhaps the people around you don't speak.
There's a woman you quote in the book, Florencia, who says, speaking Spanish helps me connect to people, not only in my social circle, we understand each other better, but also to Latinos I encounter in an everyday setting, like waiters or the nannies at my daughter's preschool. They cannot believe that I speak Spanish. When I do, it gives us an instant connection. And that was a really interesting quote, because you seem to have a lot there about sort of, you know, that, yes, language, but also class and sort of community relationships. So how is language working as a, you know, is it a way that Latin American Jews sort of are part of a larger sort of trans Latino sort of group here, or is it a way to navigate that, or sort of how does it work?
Well, I think language is kind of a bridge, right? So, and we tend to focus on our common denominators. So if I'm from Massachusetts and somebody else from Massachusetts, we start talking about Massachusetts things, I don't really care about the Patriots or the Red Sox, but I kind of pretend to,
Sure.
because that establishes a connection. Well, that's much deeper when you speak the same language. And I think people do that not only with each other, but yes, absolutely they do it in restaurants. I did a lot of these interviews in restaurants, and I saw this happen over and over. I had one woman that said to me, you know, what happens when I speak to someone in Spanish is that it's a small moment of intimacy. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
She said, it's fleeting,
Yeah.
but it adds to my day,
Yeah.
right? It's this sort of small connection that I make. And I see that people make these. And what happens is that people will absolutely erect class divisions. But at the same time, it also makes them feel like they are part of the larger Latino ethnicity and group. What happens, I think, is that Latino culture is in some ways constructed in the United States, right? Mexican culture is very different from Argentine culture, but in the United States, you focus on what you have in common. So that's I think important, and I think the Latino aspect is what is what keeps Latino Jews at the margin. Right?
And what are the things that, before we get to that, what are the things that because you talk about the way in which, and Latino Jews seem to be such an interesting way to look at this, that ethnicity and identity is sort of triggered or picked up by different influences. So when you're filling out a college application, or when there's a president who hates Hispanic people, you may feel differently about some part of you that,
Sure.
you know, you can feel you can grab a kind of a Latino part of yourself. So talk to us about that kind of like input, output of sort of identity that you write about in the book, of sort of how Latino-ness gets expressed because of the situation that Latino Jews encounter here.
So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think what is interesting about this group and why it was such an interesting group to study is that they have more ethnic choices. Not only because they can belong to different groups, but because they don't face the same constraints that, say, more darker skinned Latino does. But their ethnicity is absolutely situational, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's not salient. And it's situational because it comes out in different, if you're with Latinos, you are more likely to talk about, to feel, to act. People will say to me, "You sound so different in Spanish." And I think, yeah, I guess, but it is, we change our tone, right? We change our way. I'm sure I walk differently. There's behaviors that we associate with language, and that's part of our identity, right? It's almost like we code switch a lot.
Yeah.
And people do this, right? They code switch, whether they're with American Jews, whether they're Latin Jews, whether you're talking to someone in a restaurant. But it does bring out some sort of your identity. You're not making it up.
Yeah.
Right?
And can you talk about because one of the things that it's two concepts that are always slippery for me that your book does a lot of work to clarify. It's this relationship between race and ethnicity, both on the sort of personal level and then on the kind of institutional or sort of national level, how we define these things. And so, can you talk about the ways I think through which Latino Jews kind of illuminate that conversation? And you talked about this a little bit at the top, but just even I've always been baffled by the census. When you fill it out and it says white, Hispanic, white, non-Hispanic, and it's like, what is it? Why does this form say this? And I think you can sort of speak to sort of how we've ended up with these categories.
So they used to ask religion on the census until about 1950. So we knew how many Jews, who were the Jews, as well as others, and that stopped after the war for obvious reasons. And when Jews fought, they staged really a big political fight to be seen as a religious minority and not an ethnic minority, i.e. they didn't want Jewish to be one of the categories. Mexicans did the same. There was a large Mexican population. But what happened was that during the Civil Rights Movement, as a way to redress some of, or redress and address some of the policies, many of the policies rather, I wouldn't say some, that marginalized Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, the Office of Management and Budget put this on the census. And it wasn't to say, oh, how many Mexicans are there? It used to actually just be Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans, and then it became larger. And it was really to understand what happens when, the reason why we should all fill out the census is because the government will give you more money if there are more people living there. The federal government.
To the states.
To the states, yes. The schools will be funded better. Now, if there's a large proportion of folks that are Mexican or Puerto Rican, which was the case, which is why this came about, where the schools were failing or there was a need for more funding, counting them was helpful. What happened? So, again, to clarify, the racial categories, they're white, black,
Native American,
Eskimo, they sort of go on, and you can choose one, you can choose more than one, you can choose other. There's also country of origin, and then there is are you Latino or Hispanic?
Under ethnicity.
Under ethnicity. What happens, and I do this also, it's terrible, but what ends up happening is that we reclassify people, right? So I go through my statistical program and I say if anybody checked off Latino and whatever, they're automatically Latino, and I'm adding them to the racial category. So through this way, we've racialized this ethnicity, right? So we talk about Latinos as one of the big sort of racial categories.
I want to pivot to another sort of tension of concepts that you've got in the book, which is this sort of seems to. I think I'm glimpsing a kind of a fight among scholars about assimilation versus transnationalism.
Sure.
And well, first let's just define those topics. But then I think it's a really kind of interesting idea or tension in thinking about sort of how modern day immigration differs from the sort of classic Ellis Island model that sort of is in movies and all that stuff.
Okay.
So can you just tell us about that? That sort of what why there's a kind of disagreement about sort of how assimilation and transnationalism sort of relate to each other?
Sure. So many transnational scholars will argue that to be transnational means that you really have a foot in two worlds, right? You have a real life, a social, economic, political, whatever it may be, life and community in your new country and your home country, which therefore doesn't allow for assimilation. And assimilation, the way that I define assimilation, is really an integration into American life. For some, it might be at the lower rungs. For some, it's in the middle. For some, it's at the higher. People come in at different levels, and they achieve different things. But assimilation also, I think, runs hand in hand with acculturation, in that folks become more American. At the same time, what it means to be American is changed by immigrants. So I think that's an important point. An American today can mean so many things, and that's because we really are, despite our president, a nation of immigrants. What happens with transnationalism is, I wouldn't say it's a completely new phenomenon. People have been going back and forth. It's just much easier now, right?
Yeah.
It's cheaper.
Yeah.
Many people can have their businesses somewhere else and live here, or vice versa. We see a lot of transnational activity in Miami and San Diego, but it's really for certain members of certain immigrants. It's not necessarily the case for everyone. And while we used to see transnationalists, Mexican immigrants,
Because of
much
the proximity.
more. Yes, it used to be very easy to come back and
Right.
forth. So that's what people did.
Yeah.
And they were true transnationals, right? They lived here, they had their home there, they had a home here, they just sort of came
Go
back
to
and
school
forth.
across the border, go home.
That's not the case anymore.
Right. Do we have to pick one? Is the idea that because both of these concepts sort of open up sort of ways of thinking about immigration, but it seems like they're in tension. That like if you assimilate, you can't have a transnationalist life, and if you have a transnationalist life, you've not quite assimilated, or that seems to be the argument. But Latino Jews seem to offer they're doing something else.
Sure.
At least that's how I read. That's how I read in the book.
I think when we think about assimilation, oftentimes we look back towards the classical assimilation theorists that really studied assimilation of the first large wave of European immigrants that came, where folks lost the language, folks didn't go back. Where were you going to go to if you were a Jew from Europe? You weren't going home.
Yeah.
You weren't going back to Italy. Some folks returned to Ireland, but folks really stayed. But it was a different kind of assimilation. Today in the post-civil rights world, we have a very different America. And I think we need to think differently about what assimilation means. And the tension is really between classical assimilation theorists and transnationalism. But new assimilation theorists give room for there to be a different kind of assimilation. You can absolutely be American and also be Mexican. There is the possibility. There's also possibility now of dual citizenship. I sort of always hark back to the institutions and what they say about our social world. But this wasn't always the case. I have an old Argentine passport, but I have it somewhere.
Yeah.
My husband is telling he doesn't need to give it up. At some point, before you needed to have given that up in
Yeah.
order to become an American citizenship. That's not the case anymore.
So let's get back to our Latino Jewish communities that are here, and just you spend time in the book kind of describing each one, the way that each one has expressed its kind of own sort of grappling with the stuff the topics we've been talking about. But I thought one way to sort of talk about them is this idea of the community centers, which are a big part of Jewish life in Latin America, and that have been sort of replicated or replaced in interesting ways by Latin American Jews that come here. Just tell us the story of that, and I think it just says a lot about sort of how that migration has played out.
So, really, the only two places where we see some kind of recreation of the Latino Jewish community is in Miami and in San Diego, and that has to do in part with how Miami is organized, and San Diego geography, right? Also, what happens in Miami is similar to what happens in Latin America, in that at the time where many Latino Jews were arriving, the city of Miami and North Miami and Dade County didn't offer the kinds of services that perhaps Lexington offers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the schools weren't so good,
Mm-hmm.
for example. The community centers weren't so good. So they try to recreate these important, what we call social cultural institutions. I wouldn't say they were super successful, they were somewhat successful. Because in Latin America, this is where Jewish life in many places takes place, particularly for families, for people of a certain age group. And it's where Jews are Jews, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to really do anything else because you're there,
Yeah.
surrounded by other Jews. And what happened in Miami is two interesting things, is that you have Jews from many different Latin American countries attending these institutions, and you start to really create sort of a pan-ethnic Latin Jewish community. You don't just have Mexican Jews, you don't have Argentine Jews, Venezuelan Jews, Peruvian Jews, you have them all there. And they all start to get to know one another. And they all start to intermarry, which is sort of marker number one of assimilation. So you have, which is really how you start to create a real Latin Jewish community,
Yeah.
which is different from the Jewish community in Miami.
Yeah.
But there, as one of the people I interviewed said to me, in Argentina, I would go to a break all the time. Here, it's the JCC. My kid goes to the Maccabiah games. We do certain things that are like it was in Argentina, but really, it's a place to work out.
and the relationship with the wider Latin communities is what? As you sort of fuse these groups into a sort of Latin Jewish. Again, these are small groups and it happens, but still sort of to spend time in the book talking about it, I think it's the identity as sort of part of a kind of wider like Latin identity is how is that?
So I think there's two parts to this question. I'll be brief. I think the Latin identity, and I will just tell you one of my favorite quotes is a woman who said to me, I'm Latin. Everything I do is different. I talk louder. I read differently. I'm a Latina. She said, we Latinos, we even die differently. I thought that was such a great quote. Meanwhile, she's a German Jew to Venezuela, right? But she's really embodied this Latin identity. So folks absolutely feel Latino, right?
Yeah.
They have big parties, and this is how they spice the food and those sorts of things. Their relationship with the non-Jewish Latino community is very much mediated by class, much the same way as it is in Latin America. So Latino Jews tend to be middle class. They might have been upper middle class in their home countries. They tend to be middle class here, perhaps upper middle class. And they have other Latin friends that are also upper middle class. But that's really where the connections are.
Okay, I think we're gonna open it up to some questions. I'm gonna paraphrase a colleague of mine, Jelani Cobb, and just say, a question is a request for information. So let's, we'll be around to chat after the event, but we've got some real questions for Laura. Let's hear them.
Which also means that we will be pretty merciless here, and we'll really ask. We'll only take like 5 questions because we have a reception and book signing, and there will be opportunities for you to have conversations. So please don't hate me too much for that. But after 5 questions, we're going to call it a day and start munching.
Each person gets 5 questions?
Each person gets 5.
Oh, I-
We start over here.
Hi, thanks a lot for bringing up the whole issue of race and ethnicity and those distinctions. I think it shifted from Hispanic being seen as racial more to ethnic, but I have a question about that because many people in the States, and including my mother, who's a Colombian Jew, think of Latino as brown people, and certainly that's the way it's being portrayed politically right now, that Latinos are these brown people. And most Jews from Central and South America are actually white racially. So don't quite know how to word my question is if you could speak a little more about that relationship of sort of the white Latino Jew and the brown Latino non-Jew and how that intersects.
So one refrain I heard a lot was, well, I'm European. And I thought, well, no, you're Mexican, but absolutely. I think, and I think that's really what I try to do in the book, to really widen our idea of what it means to be Latino and how it has been racialized, and therefore how folks don't feel that that term or applies to them per se. But Eric and I were talking last week, and one of the things that I did say to him was, what people, every time I ask the census question, they go, oh, I don't know. And part I think it's because people don't really answer the census. I always ask my students, like, I've never even seen the census. I've never seen the census. But what you find is that folks will say, well, I'm not Latino, but I am when I'm applying to school. Or I am when I'm applying, and they technically are. However the school wants to view it, because really, when a school is asking if you're a Latino or Hispanic, it's really about underrepresented minorities. This is a whole other discussion. But yes, I think it's complicated, and folks have the option of checking off white and Latino on the census. But Latino, again, is a completely separate question from your race question.
Now, it didn't used to be. When I was going through school, it was like a racial thing.
On the census, though, on the census.
This is fascinating, okay? I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, grew up in Queens, live on Long Island, okay? And I'm surprised to know that there are Jews from Latin America. What is the intermingling, if any, of Latin American Jews with Ashkenazi Sephardic Jews in these communities? Do Latin American Jews have their own synagogues? I mean, we all go to KCCs, but how or do Latin American Jews intermingle with European Sephardic Jews now?
Have we heard the question?
The question was, how do Latin American Jews intermingle with the pre-existing Ashkenazi or Sephardic communities in the U.S.?
Right, originally, but.
No, they still are.
Yeah, I
They
know,
still-
but.
They still are.
As sort of new community groups, how are they interacting with the pre-existing community groups?
They absolutely interact, I think. Much more so in the Northeast, where there are fewer opportunities to interact with other Latino Jews. There's a Latin Jewish Chabad Center here in New York City, which is quite active and has many members. They tend to be on the younger side. But there's a synagogue in Boston where the rabbi is Chilean and the cantor is Argentine, and it might attract more Latino Jews, but there's just not a big community, so absolutely.
Gentleman
I
here.
have a question. Back to the racial thing. So, at one point you said, the Jews now are considered white. But when you consider the Jews of the world, there are many black, from Ethiopia, Chinese, and Indians. So, as a totality, you can't say the Jews are white. They're white with others, or mixed, or whatever they are. The other thing is, now in the United States, as you know, some groups are calling us out, as during the German period, I have to say this, as revealing that we're not white. The white supremacists are reminding others that we're not really white, we're honorary white, or temporarily white, or not so white, or somewhat white, or not really so white, after all. So that's another layer, you know, to the whiteness of the Jews. It's not so much that. The question is, what do you think about that? Right, I'm counting what she said. That's the question. It's a lie, that's Jews.
I'll be very brief. I tell this to my students all the time. As sociologists, we don't make gross generalizations, but we really talk about the majority. It's very hard to say. You know, we all have. My students always say, "Wait, but I have a friend who." So that doesn't. And in the United States, absolutely, there are Black Jews, there are Asian Jews. There was just a great book written called Jew-Asian by Helen Kim. There are a number of different kinds of Jews that are not phenotypically white. But I use white not necessarily just as a racial category, but really as an entry into the mainstream. And yes, I think you're right. We are absolutely seeing an upswing of white nationalism. What does that mean for the Jews? It means more anti-Semitic acts, absolutely. Does it mean that our day-to-day is going to be affected? I'm not sure to what extent, right? Does it mean that Jews are going to be seen as racially different?
By some people, but not here in New York.
Let's move to question number 4, because someone is really waiting to ask this question, and that's the young man from the first row.
So, you said that you were saying that but no, you're Mexican, but shouldn't it be a choice to be Mexican, or shouldn't it be a choice what race you are or what ethnicity you are?
So I think the idea of choice is, we as a society construct the idea of race, and it can change, and perhaps it is possible that what we are going to see now is that Jews as part of the white majority might change. That might be possible. Can it be a choice? Well, if you're Mexican and you're from Mexico, it's not, you're Mexican. But if you're Mexican and you don't have an accent and you don't look Mexican, you don't have to tell anybody you're Mexican. Nobody needs to know. It's your choice to tell them. And that is a difference that not everybody has.
And question number 5 will be from the gentleman all the way in the back, because we tend to ask people in front. Please. And that's going to be the last question for tonight on the official part.
Can you speak more about what is the uniqueness of the Jewish identity within Latino Jews? Ashkenazi Jews kept their Yiddish or their foods. What is this in the Jewish identity you want to hear more within Jewish Latino, or is there some Jewish identity?
Do I want to answer? I mean, I would say being the just not as the scholar, but just as in personal experience. I mean, there's a lot of overlap. There's plenty that would be recognizable. That just didn't require a lot of translation. But then there I would say that sort of stuff sneaks in. The dessert that you make at at a holiday meal, or the sports that you talk about over the table, or the music that a lot of the Jewish songs might overlap, but then the kind of lay music that you might listen to is going to be different. Those are sort of weird pathways, kind of almost more into the Latinness than I would say the Judaism.
But those are the building blocks for culture, right? That's how culture is built among these sort of small pathways, as Eric said. So absolutely. And I think the important thing to think about also is that Jewishness and Jewish identity in Latin America does not necessarily revolve around the synagogue. So there are many ways to express being Jewish without going to synagogue, and that becomes part of your identity. That's very different from being Jewish in the United States.
What is it? It's not the synagogue. What is
Center for Jewish History. Wait.
The country clubs, the schools. What you find in Latin America is that the government is not doesn't provide the same level of services that the United States has. So if I move to the suburbs for the good schools, I'm not sending my kid to private school, right? I'm already paying $25,000 a year in taxes. That's enough. In Latin America, where folks tend to stay in the cities, and the schools are not always as good. There are ethnic schools, not just Jewish schools. There are German schools. There are lots of different ethnic schools that keep the community together. The Jewish, many children in Latin America, the majority of children in Mexico, for example, attend Jewish day schools. That's a big transference of Jewish culture and Jewish identity.
And on that note,